Hello, welcome to today's webinar with CCgroup and Transformer Insights, where we will be discussing the IoT technology buying process and the steps IoT buyers go through when they're making their purchasing decisions. Before we get started, there are a few housekeeping rules that we'd just like to go over and mention before we start the session. The first is that all participants today are muted for the duration of the webinar. But if you do have any questions, do feel free to pop those into the chat box, and we will have a dedicated section at the end of the session to answer any questions that you might have. Also, just to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and it is available on request. So if you would like a copy of the recording, do get in touch with us once the webinar has finished. Just to give you a little bit of background on who we are as your speakers today, my name is Chloe and I'm the head of IoT at CCgroup. I've been working in B2B tech PR for just over 11 years now, working across a variety of different sectors from telecoms and deep tech through to enterprise technology and broadcast and media. Working on a variety of different technologies from 5G and 6G to different network technologies and of course IoT. And I'll hand over to Duncan to introduce himself.
Thanks, Chloe. Yep. Hi, I'm Duncan. I'm head of deep tech at CCgroup. I'm largely concerned with looking out for new technologies that are emerging and working with those companies to make their voices heard. I've been in technology PR for 24 years, alarmingly, but loving every minute of it. Let me hand over to Matt.
Thank you, Duncan. So Matt Hatton, I'm one of the founding partners at Transformer Insights, and I was just totting up my number of years as well, and it turns out that's I've just passed 24 years as well, so similarly experienced. I've always been an industry analyst, pretty much.
So to start off today's webinar, the first half of the webinar is really going to be focused on some findings from a recent research report that we did around how IoT vendors can successfully market and sell to IoT buyers. It discusses the different types of content and marketing channels that IoT buyers are engaging with, and the types of channels and contents they find most influential at different stages of the buying journey. So a little bit about why we did the research. At CCgroup, we work with a number of companies across the telecoms, deep tech and IoT industries, and you know, there's a lot of focus for these companies to be able to sell to IoT buyers. There's the proliferation of 5G networks being turned on, lots of discussion around 6G and what that can enable as well from an Internet of Things and connected living perspective. So you know, we're very much in the IoT reality now. It's very much in the here and now. So for companies that are operating in this space, whether they're providing the technology that allows the connectivity in which the Internet of Things relies upon, or it's technology and solutions that connects networks and sensors and devices, it's really important for these players in the markets and for any tech vendor that's in this space to understand how IoT buyers are making their purchasing decisions. So our report really looks at as I said, how technology vendors can successfully market and sell to IoT buyers, and it covers a number of different topics. The first is the impact that the COVID-19 pandemic has had on the IoT buying process. It covers the most influential content types for awareness and selecting technology vendors. It includes the most influential marketing channels for identifying, shortlisting and selecting technology partners. And there's also some interesting stats here around the importance of social media and the importance of industry analysts. And finally, it also breaks down all of this stuff for specific IoT buying groups. So for today's webinar, for the first half, I'll be talking through some of the key findings and touching upon some of these areas. A little bit on the methodology of how we conducted the survey and how we built our report. So we worked in partnership with B2B and consumer market research agency Sapio Research, where we surveyed 150 IoT technology buyers. And those buyers were across operations, supply chain and IT departments in the UK, the US and some of Europe, so in Germany and France. And for the report, we've really categorised IoT technology buyers into 3 groups. The first being end user organisations, the second being OEM organisations, and the third being app developer and system integrator vendors. And when I talk about the IoT buying journeys for customer groups, these are the 3 customer groups that I'll be focusing on. So to start with the impact of COVID on the IoT buying process. So, you know, there's no denying that COVID has impacted lots of different industries, lots of different sectors, and IoT is just one of them. Whether it's been supply chain disruptions, wherever it's been economic impact that at the start of the pandemic would have cancelled contracts altogether. What our research really shows is the impact that COVID has had and the reliance that IoT buyers have on external parties, on marketing content and marketing channels to be able to make their IoT buying decisions. So, I mean, it doesn't really come as much as a surprise that 83% of IoT buyers said that the COVID-19 pandemic has caused delays to the IoT technology buying process. When we look at this in a bit more detail, the delays aren't too long lasting. A third said that delays had been less than 6 months, and half said that delays had been typically between 6 to 9 months. But what it really has done is it has pushed the reliance on external sources to be able to identify partners and to be able to make buying decisions. So 98%, that's almost all IoT buyers, said that they watch or read business media to make technology buying decisions. So having, as a tech vendor, having a presence in the business media is really important. 42% of IoT buyers have been reading more trade media since the pandemic and since home working has begun. And they've also been engaging a lot more with events as well. So 44% of IoT buyers have said that they've participated in a lot more trade media driven events as a result of home working as well. And the events thing is actually really quite interesting because when we look at that in a bit more detail, 92% of IoT buyers actually watch live or pre-recorded content from virtual events. 90% also said that they've actually contacted a vendor as a result of participating in an industry event, and 89% have said that participating in industry events is a really good indicator of a vendor's knowledge and expertise. And then finally, 3/4 of IoT buyers have said that they've actually been relying on trusted third parties as a result of COVID-19 to help with the buying process. So really, what this highlights is, as I said to start with, the impact that COVID has had on how IT buyers are engaging with external content and the validation that they need. So vendors really need to be able to showcase their experience and their knowledge and their expertise across the media, at events, and as well to some of the third parties. But really, when we think about influencing the buying process, it's not just one area that vendors need to focus on. It's really a confluence of 3 key things that will have an impact on being able to successfully market and sell to IoT buyers. The first is what you say, so the content that you put out. The second is where you say that, so the channels that you say that on. And then thirdly is when you say that. So really it's thinking about what content you have, where you're saying at what part of the buying journey. So what content is important, raising awareness, what content is important for the shortlisting process, and what content and what channels are important to be selected as a technology partner. So let's start off with that first point there about what you say and the types of content. So as part of the survey, we asked IoT buyers about the types of content they value when they're trying to learn more about a technology vendor. And so for awareness and identifying technology vendors, you'll see here that industry analyst reports ranked as the most influential type of content, and that was shortly followed by email marketing, case studies, white paper reports, and event conferences and speeches. So what that really shows us is that that external validation is really important in the awareness process. And email marketing is perhaps working with industry analysts or working with trade media on paid activity there to showcase your knowledge, your experience, your expertise, and that experience there is really important with case studies. IT buyers clearly want to see that you can walk the walk as well as talk the talk. And white paper reports and event conference speeches here is really about demonstrating thought leadership, understanding of their challenges, and putting that out to the market. So that's for awareness. And when we look at selection, so the types of content that IoT buyers engage with when it comes to actually selecting a technology partner, it's quite interesting to see how these change slightly. So email marketing ranks first, but then we also see here the addition of vendor webinars, news articles, and vendor social media content as well. So again, the webinars and the news articles really feeds into this idea of being able to demonstrate your knowledge, your experience and your expertise to the market. And social media content, I'll come on to that in a little bit more detail in a moment, but spoiler alert, if you haven't got a social media program in place, then you really need to get one. So then when we look at the second point there, so that's the what you say, the where you say it for the marketing channel. So for awareness, here we've got management consultants, web search, business technology media, promotions in trade media and social media as well. So again, this external validation here is really important for awareness. The online promotions link in with the email marketing we just saw. Business technology media links to what I said a moment ago about almost all IoT buyers are watching or reading business trade media, and web search as well. Here we can see that IT buyers are simply Googling to see who's coming up, so SEO is going to be an important factor there. For shortlisting, the external third parties change slightly here. So we've got internal business analysts and peers, so buyers simply asking people they know whether they can recommend, or whether the people that they've identified, the partners that they've identified are worthy of being on their lists. And vendor webinars again make an appearance, showing that knowledge and that experience. And then finally for selection, it really is all about industry presence and knowledge and your presence in the market. So it's trade media, webinars, industry associations, and business technology media, which again is no surprise considering that 98% stat. Social media is actually a really interesting one here. When we look at some of the detail around the role that social media is playing in the IoT buying process, 80% of IoT buyers are engaging with social media on a weekly basis. And when you drill into that a little bit further, almost 2/3 are checking it daily. So, you know, it's a reference point, whether it's to understand things that are happening in the market, players that are in the market, what people are saying. You know, your core audience is really does have a social media presence, and they're looking at social media. And what else does it mean for the buying process? Well, here over half, 54% believe that social media has a heavy influence on the awareness of a technology vendor. So if they're doing web search, they might also be searching social media to find technology vendor partners. And just under half here say that social media has contributed to vendors actually being shortlisted for RFPs. So, you know, considering some of this data here, as a technology vendor, it's really important to make sure that you have social media as part of an integrated marketing communications program. And then just on to analyst relations. So again, have been speaking about the role of third parties, and industry analysts are actually a really important third party when it comes to the IoT buying process. So 2/5 of IoT buyers I say that the process involves industry analysts, and 1 in 3 actually say that more than half of their purchasing decisions involve industry analysts. We saw a little while ago that industry analyst reports ranked as the most influential piece of content for awareness, and that's further backed up here. 43% of IoT buyers are using an industry analyst to identify and shortlist vendors, and they're using those reports as a really valuable content source to learn about a vendor. So now I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail about the different buying journeys for each of the IoT buying groups. So looking at how end user organisations, OEM organisations and app developers and system integrators, their individual buying journeys and how they differ and the types of content and channels that they interact and engage with. So starting with end user organisations and the what to say that content. So for awareness, end user organisations are really relying on white papers, webinars and industry analyst reports. So again, it's using those third parties, and it's advocating and showcasing experience. And for selection is actually email marketing, webinars and social media content. When we look at how this maps with the most influential marketing channels, so for awareness, web search actually ranks as the most influential as a marketing channel. And when we think about those content types, so white papers, analyst reports are all going to contribute to SEO that will play a role in web search. And then for shortlisting and for selection, you know, industry presence is really important. Media and influencer relations, so that's trade media, that's business media, and also industry analysts, and you know, third parties there as well, covers that. So here for end user organisations, it's really important to have a presence in the trade media, communicate across, you know, own channels, communicate reports, white papers, not just to the trade media, but on your own channels as well. When we look at OEM organisations, so the content types here change quite significantly. So for OEM organisations, for awareness, they rely on email marketing. So that will be the online promotions with trade media. And then for selection, it's that email marketing again, event speeches and podcasts. And when we look at the marketing channels, this mirrors this really well. So you've got the paid channels and the email marketing. You've got shortlisting, industry presence and vendor-owned channels, so that's where the podcasts come in. And then for selection, again, it's those vendor-owned channels. So, you know, social media, websites, blogs, they're all going to be really important when thinking about targeting OEM organisations. And then finally, for app developers and systems integrators, for awareness, industry analyst reports feature again here. And for selection, it's news articles, opinion articles, and industry analyst reports. So for app developers, out of all of the IoT buying groups, this seems to be the group that are the most influenced by industry presence, thought leadership, and you know, that outward communication of knowledge and experience to the industry. And again, we can see that this ties really well with the marketing channels that they find most influential. So vendor-owned channels and third parties to start with, links in with the industry analyst reports, and then for shortlisting and selection, this is really where demonstrating that experience and knowledge is important. So media and influencer relations, and the paid marketing channels as well. So that can be email marketing. So to conclude this first half of the webinar, really, you know, COVID-19 has clearly had an impact on how IoT buyers are making their technology decisions, what they're referring to, what sources they use, and what types of content and channels they engage with. They're really relying on trusted third parties to make purchasing decisions. They're reading more media, whether that's trade media, whether it's business media, and they're clearly engaging and interacting with industry events. Social media is really important as a marketing channel. It's being used to identify partners. It's being used to get companies onto RFP lists. And so having a social media strategy and program in place is going to be really important. But outside of that, what we can take away from the different buying journeys here is that it's really important to understand who your customer audience is, which group of IoT buyers are you trying to target, because each group interacts with different types of content in different ways. So, you know, different content is going to be more important to certain types of IoT buyers than it is to others, and which channels you use at which stage is also going to be really important. So having an understanding of that is really crucial. So the secret to successful influence is really knowing who your customers are, where they fit, and making sure that you have an integrated marketing communications program in place that looks at the different stages of the buying journey and speaks to those audiences accordingly. Now I'm going to hand over to Matt, and he will talk through some of his slides.
Thank you, Chloe. Yes, delighted to be here. Share some thoughts on the sales process for IoT, and indeed the buying process for IoT. I introduced myself right at the start, though I should say a few words about Transformer Insights, really. We're an industry analyst firm, relatively new. We started about 3 or 4 months before lockdown back in November 2019, and we focus on digital transformation, or rather a whole set of technologies that sit under an umbrella of digital transformation, one of which probably our key focus is in fact Internet of Things. And what we do is effectively advise both the buyers and sellers of technology, so technology adopters and technology vendors. We advise on technical and commercial best practice, plus also market forecasting and market sizing and those sorts of things as well. So it was an interesting challenge to pull together some thoughts on the buying process and the selling process, and look at things predominantly from the perspective of the enterprise and what they're adopting and the process they go through to select vendors, well, indeed to make a decision about buying anything at all, and then to select vendors. And we're a pretty important part of this, as Chloe mentioned. Analysts are a really important part of the IoT buying process, I believe were her exact words, and I couldn't agree more. You know, people listen to us and what we have to say about who the good vendors are. Now, I'm not going to be talking about specific vendors, but what I'm going to talk about today is the buying process. What kind of things an adopter might be doing, what kind of a process they might go through in terms of how they pick who they want to buy things from and what they might buy. But let's take a step back and kind of zoom out a little bit first. IoT is a pretty complex space, and there is a process that's kind of difficult for an end user to navigate, to go through understanding what they ought to be doing and working out who are the sensible vendors in the space and so on. So the first thing we want to do is really define exactly what we want to do, or rather what the adopters need to do is to define exactly what they want to do before even embarking on this buying journey. And in fact, that will influence to a great extent some of these decisions early on in the process, the sort of top part of this chart I'm showing. A lot of those decisions will influence what the buying behavior and the buying process might be, i.e. if what you're trying to do is something that's less mission critical to you as an organization, you might make a certain set of buying decisions. If it's absolutely critical, you might move in a different direction. If you've got an existing set of partners that you already work with, then you might decide in a certain direction that's different from if you don't. So let me talk you through this a little bit. So the first thing to do is find out what the leaders in the industry are doing. This is your horizon scanning, understanding it's kind of the art of the possible. What should we as a company in this space be looking at? And if you're really at the bleeding edge of the space as an adopter, you'd be trying to talk to people like me to find out what even might be beyond the horizon and possible to do. But essentially, we're looking at lessons learned. We do a bunch of stuff around this, looking at analysing case studies of deployments that have happened around the world. We've got a big case study database. People often tap us up to have a look at that and see, okay, well, who in the retail space in my region is doing what. So that's a good place to start. But you know, it's a fairly nebulous topic, this kind of horizon scanning, understanding what you need to do. The next would be to look at developments in comparable industries. So it's not just about what your own industry is doing, but also thinking about what other industries are doing, adjacent spaces, you know, what might be transplantable into another. So I think perhaps of okay, fleet management. There's quite sophisticated stuff happening in fleet management, and what happens there may well be portable into ambulances. Now, those are completely different markets. One delivering goods, the other one delivering perhaps not so goods, if you think about ambulances that way. But they may be able to learn potentially from each other and port in some capabilities. So first of all, you look at your industry, then you look at wider industry. You then kind of filter down and identify your key use cases that might be most impactful in this sort of filtering process. And then you work out which of the technologies, I describe it as DX here, that's digital transformation, but the same is applicable to IoT. You work out which technologies are most relevant to you and which you're likely to need in order to support the solution that you're wanting to do. And at that point, you come to the question of identifying vendors. and that's really what I'm going to talk about predominantly today. It's prioritizing vendors, and as a first thought, or this will be the main takeaway, really what you want to do is prioritize companies that have got some expertise, some experience, that have deployed, because there is a tremendous amount of examples within IoT of companies saying, yes, we can do that, when in fact pretty much any supplier can do just about anything. The question will always be, am I paying them to do the learning on my time, or have they got a huge amount of expertise in this vertical and in this technology area that they're able to apply to my particular requirements? And then you need a plan for deployment, but I'm going to focus more on this question of identifying key vendors. I want to give an example, a couple of examples, in fact, just to kick off, and I'll move through this fairly quickly. There are many different examples of IoT deployments. The diversity of it is just flabbergasting. And the way you might approach the buying journey is going to be different depending on who it is that you're, or what it is that you're doing. So to give two examples, one is a smart tractors solution. So there's a couple of farmers called James and Alistair Heath who implemented a smart tractor solution at their farm in the UK. They adopted a precision farming solution from a company called Ria Valley Tractors. It was their real-time kinetics service, and that provides plus or minus 2 centimeter accuracy location for their John Deere tractors, which were retrofitted with this solution. And then the data was gathered and supplied to the My John Deere operations center. So that's one use case. Contrast that with a smart metering solution. Okay, this is I've picked one here, and one of hundreds, thousands probably of smart meter deployments around the world. In this case, it was Enedis in France, which rolled out 35 million smart meters in France. Okay, very different use cases, and very different in terms of the capabilities and the thought processes and the skills required to deploy. So if we look at the characteristics of these applications, they are fundamentally very different. And because of that, who you would buy from would be very different. So for instance, the smart metering, the device count, there's millions of devices, whereas in the smart tractor example, there are very few devices. But the tractor example is much richer. It requires artificial intelligence. It requires a human interface. It requires human machine interface. It requires some consideration of really detail how the how data is going to be managed. Whereas it's much more of a functional process of deploying this smart metering rollout. And the upshot of all that is, it will dictate how you handle your sourcing. Okay, what I'm showing on the right hand side here is on a couple of axes. Okay, so on the vertical axis, we've got the depth of enterprise integration. You know, how deep into your organization does the application go? I'll give a good example. If you might have a multinational company who has a car park next to their HQ, and they want to put in a smart parking scheme within that organization, that is almost irrelevant to the operations of the company. Although, you know, if you were an employee there and you couldn't find a parking space, you might think it was pretty relevant, but essentially it's irrelevant to the operations of the organization. You contrast that with, I mean, for instance, the smart metering example, or the smart tractors example, that is fundamental to how that organization might operate. You then think on the other axis of the potential of using that as a competitive differentiator. Here, the example of the tractor and the smart meter is pretty good. For the smart metering, it's not really much of a competitive differentiator. Whereas for the smart tractor, it's a significant differentiator. It will allow them to differentiate a great deal. And this dictates whether it's the approach is one of building or buying the solution. Do you want something off the shelf, or do you want something bespoke and customized? In the case of the smart tractor, it's probably bespoke and customized. In the case of the smart meter, it's almost certainly off the shelf, and that would dictate what types of companies, who you will go to. The utility will almost certainly go to a smart meter manufacturer. The tractor manufacturer will need the tractor user, in fact, will need a custom bespoke job, probably using a systems integrator and so on. So to hopefully move on to the next slide, which seems to have worked eventually. There we go. Right. So what you end up there then is a whole set of different skills required amongst the between the two use cases you've got. The tractor, it's almost a voyage into the unknown. You've got evolving client needs. You probably have to run pilots and so on. And what you're really aiming for is something tremendously value added. Whereas in the smart metering, you pretty much know what you're expecting, and this is about delivery. It's a procurement exercise. It's an enterprise change management exercise. They work in very different ways. So hopefully I've given you the idea that these are very different projects and very different ways that you might approach them. And one of the things that we've delved into, and we published a report on it not so long ago, was looking at, okay, well, in that case, I need to be razor sharp focused on what the capabilities I require are, and I also then need to think very specifically about what the vendor selection might be and what capabilities I want with the vendor. And so how you pick will depend on some of those factors I talked about with regard to the tractors versus the smart meters. Some of it's about phase. Are you in fact, phase and function really sit quite closely together. What stage are you at, and what kind of a role do you want the organization to perform? Is it the preliminary strategic assessment, or is it an implementation phase? Do you need a systems integrator? Do you just need a product? Do you need a project manager? Very much dependent on where the enterprise is in terms of the phase of the process and therefore the functions that are required. You then have to think about the solution that's needed. Is this off the shelf, or is this bespoke? And that will depend on a lot of the issues that I discussed earlier. You then think about capabilities. Okay, well, once I've determined what the shape of what I'm requiring is, you then understand what the capabilities might be. Which technologies, which functional building blocks am I actually going to need in order to address what I require? What I'm showing on the right-hand side of this chart is an assessment that we did of the hyperscale cloud providers, AWS, Microsoft, and Google. And we do this kind of assessment of companies all the time. And what we were looking at was their relative capabilities across the range of digital transformation technology families that we look at. Some are better than others. I mean, that almost inevitably goes without saying, but this looking for capabilities is a critical one. And then context. Okay, so context is about the types of projects that the company might be good at. Where have they an established heritage? Not necessarily about the technical capabilities, but just where have they built the expertise, the knowledge of the sector that you might be involved in. And in fact, that relates to industry as well. That's more specifically on the vertical, whereas context is maybe about, okay, am I trying to build a software as a service solution, or am I trying to build well, not necessarily software as a service, because that wouldn't really be IoT, but an as a service business model, for instance, or am I dealing with something in the government sector which might have particular rules about procurement or about regulation? So all of these things are important. So then we get on to the actual procurement process. And this is how we advise enterprises to select things. First off, you're looking for a solution, an industry match. Has somebody got a set of capabilities, and are they working in an industry where they're familiar with the requirements that you need? For instance, someone like an SAP might have a ready-to-go solution in that field. Then we look at capability and context match. That's IoT or AI expertise more broadly. Then we look at the commercial match. For instance, do you already have an existing commercial relationship with an organization, and therefore expanding upon that makes sense? And then you pull all those together in it, and that provides a guide to who the most appropriate vendors might be. There's rather more detail to it than that, but that gives a pretty good overview. So what does that mean for a seller? Well, we've got a few suggestions here based on the research that we've done. One is focus on who you're selling to and the sensitivities of those roles. So I've talked a lot about how each of the applications or each of the IoT use cases might have very different requirements for what their buying is. Well, different roles have different requirements for how they're buying. So a developer might buy in a very different way from the marketing department or the finance department. So that will, who's responsible for that might very well depend on what type of project it is, but you have to have one eye on who the actual end buyer is. Number two, emphasize your credibility in the specifics. I mentioned this idea of everybody in IoT saying, well, we can do that. But the problem is that's very much a me too approach to things. What you need to be able to demonstrate is real credibility, real established business within a particular sector the company might be looking at. We expect quite a lot of verticalization. Don't be afraid of that specialization. I think there's going to be virtuous circles for vendors whose offering isn't necessarily vertically oriented, but then finding that they're selling more in particular sectors, developing more expertise, not necessarily in terms of the functionality of the product, although that might come, but particularly in terms of just the knowledge and understanding of the space. The fourth one, prove you're in this for the long haul. IoT is about long-term relationships. This isn't a transactional relationship. You need to be a trusted third party for the companies that are procuring from you. So establishing that you're going to be there for the long haul and are a supportive organization. 5, go where the customers are. Generally, people don't buy IoT or buy an IoT. What they're looking for is, well, they don't necessarily know what they're looking for, but they probably wouldn't go looking for it in necessarily the usual places or the places where vendors might necessarily want to sell. You've got to go to engineering trade shows, or you've got to go to healthcare conferences, or you've got to go to those places where the enterprises are. You've got to understand the phases that the client will go through. I've talked through a lot of those, so you can position yourself for being most appropriately able to support on the relevant phases. And you've got to know your enemy, understand the competitive landscape, and understand the competitive landscape. I showed that chart earlier about showing the hyperscalers. Well, they're a particularly prominent part of the competitive landscape, but it's all relevant. You have to know how you fit relative to all those other players in the space. And at that point, I am going to hand things over to Duncan, I believe.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, very interesting, and I like that there's a lot of parallels between what you see in vendor behavior, buyer behavior, that we saw in buyer behavior as well in our survey, and that was reassuring that we're on the same page.
Absolutely.
I guess, you know, there's a few points you raised which are worth discussing a little bit more, perhaps. You were talking about you know, making sure that when you're approaching buyers, that you address them specifically with what they need. What kinds of things do you think they should be aiming to demonstrate? You talked a little bit, for instance, about sort of you know, ability to deliver, but what kinds of things should they be showing? What sort of features?
Well, it's competence in the tech, clearly. That's you know, it's that's sort of table stakes, I guess, is the term, but also familiarity with the sector. You know, I think increasingly as IoT grows, we'll see more fragmentation, and there's more opportunity or more likelihood that you'll get more and more specialization. And so you have to demonstrate an understanding of the vertical that your clients are working in. And it's also that question of being in it for the long haul. You know, as I said, this is about being a trusted partner for the buyer, and so, you know, you've got to position yourself to be worthy of that trust, shall we say?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And on that, building trust is obviously very important. Then, so from a customer perspective, from a buying perspective, is it normal, or would they be foolhardy to leap straight into a major strategic deployment without ever having gone through any sort of test deployments first? You know, is there something solution vendors can do to help them on their journey to a full solution, rather than an auxiliary sort of, you know, non-strategic solution?
Yeah, this question of it's more a question of going through the process of proofs of concept, and we've been banging on for ages about this concept of POC hell, and some people call it pilot purgatory, and whatever. The whole idea is there's been a lot of testing of the waters with IoT, and actually less real deployments in terms of, you know, you try things out and it doesn't really seem to work. The key there to make the process, or make the progress from the pilots and POCs into real deployments, is for the vendors actually to be pretty strict with the buyers. You know, many will come to you with from the IT department saying, yeah, I want to run a POC doing this, and that actually, are you really doing a POC, or are you just sort of dabbling around? And there's things like you've got to think very carefully if you don't charge for it. You know, it's very easy to do these things for free. You've got to have some specific success criteria in mind before you run them. You have to lay out, okay, well, if we hit these kinds of parameters on the POC, then it goes to the full deployment phase. This is not something in isolation. It has to be a part of a process. And there are a number of others, but the other one I was thinking about was, you've got to make sure that your client has thought about the commercial and operational implications rather than just the technical, because, you know, as I mentioned, often it's the IT department that comes to you and says, I want to run this project. Well, we love the IT department, but they really shouldn't be running the IoT projects. It's got to have C-level buy-in. It's got to have some kind of understanding what the commercial and operational implications are, and that has to be taken account of in the POC, because if they haven't thought about that, then forget it. The chances of it moving to full commercial deployment is minimal, should we say.
Okay. And you touched on, I mean, there's a certain degree of complexity in what you just described there, different parts of the organization getting involved or affected by what's happening, but you also talked earlier on about the complexity of solutions, not just on the technical side, but on the, you know, the business impact side and the infrastructure side and so on. It is a very complex landscape. Do you think organizations understand that innately? Is there a way that they can you know, simply score the complexity of their projects, or is there something that vendors can do to help them with that complexity?
I mean, we as analysts like to think you can apply a score to pretty much anything, right? You know, you can sit down and quantify whatever you've got in front of you, but the reality is rather more complicated. But the reality is you've hardly got any adopters who are in any way as informed or knowledgeable about IoT as the suppliers who they're going to. Because this is effectively companies in every sector under the sun baking in some kind of very complicated technological solution involving hardware, connectivity, software and middleware, data analytics, back-end processing of data into their already established but probably slightly rickety back office functions. And that you know, there's obviously a mismatch of understanding or mismatch of knowledge. I think that the key there is to really establish credibility, establish I mean, it comes back to this trust issue again, because for many of these companies, regardless of whether they run fully thought through POCs, you're still taking something of a leap into the dark, and what you want is some kind of confidence that the organization whose hand you're holding as you make that leap into the dark is a credible one, knowledgeable, understands the space. Now, a good place to start to understand that kind of thing is to talk to us analysts, because you know we've got a pretty good idea of who knows what they're talking about, who understands the space, and who's likely to be around for the duration. And you know, we don't particularly have an axe to grind on it. So independent view on that. So that's yeah, I'm always going to say come talk to an analyst, but come to an analyst.
Come to you see a broader view than a lot of organizations. I think earlier on you talked about talking of a broad view. I think Transformer, correct me if I'm wrong, but you list about 20 or so different vertical industries for you know, transformation and IoT and things. You said that you expect IoT to become increasingly verticalized. So I guess I'm just wondering, are there some that are more lucrative than others? Are there some that are going to mature faster? And how many, from a vendor perspective, how many verticals is it reasonable to try to tackle? Because I think 20 is probably quite a lot for anybody to do.
Yeah, I mean, that's not specialization at all. That's just going after all of the verticals, which doesn't really help you very much. I mean, the reason why we've got 20 is because that's how many verticals there are, right? So that 20 covers the entire span. I mean, a risk of sounding a lot like an analyst, I'm going to say it depends, but of course it does depend. It depends what it is you're selling, what aspect of IoT it is that you're selling. So you take the example of something like connectivity. I had a little look through our forecast numbers because I had a suspicion you might ask me something along these lines. And it's utilities. That's a strong space. I mean, you take somebody like Itron. So they've carved out a set of capabilities and a space within that utilities list. You know, to all intents and purposes, they've got a broadly horizontal set of offers, the hardware notwithstanding, but you know, they could address a whole bunch of sectors, but they've established a good set of credibility in that utility space. And then think about transportation. That's probably the next one down the list. And there are certain companies that have established a lot of credibility in addressing global deployments with I don't know, fleet management or container tracking or whatever. So you've got the likes of Core or some of the bigger mobile operators like a Vodafone, for instance. So there is a certain amount of specialization there, and I could go on forever and ever about the mobile network operators and their specialization, but they've all done it. They've picked some verticals where they have some right to play, and they focus pretty laser-like on those. A couple of others I'd mention are government. So for smart cities, that's a pretty healthy space, particularly post-COVID. There's a lot of incentives to ramp up spending on things to keep people in cities, for want of a better term. I mean, I don't mean that in a barbed wire fences kind of way. I mean a pull factor rather than anything else. And then agriculture and retail, I'd say, are probably the other two that would be worth taking a look at. And how many? I mean, how long's a piece of string? It depends on how big the organisation is and so on. I don't think there's a correct answer on that one, to be honest.
Okay, cool. I have 1,000 questions to ask you, but I want to just ask Chloe a couple of questions as well. So if we could just maybe just move back and bring Chloe in for the closing couple of minutes for the webinar here. Hi, Chloe. So when you're thinking about this report that we put together and everything that Matt said, there's a lot of emphasis on demonstrating what you're capable of, demonstrating your skills, your experience, building a relationship, and in the case of influence in our report, thought leadership. It's talking to the media or shouting into social media is a very noisy space. So what is it that you think vendors can do to make their story stand out from other vendors or competitors, really?
Oh yeah, I think when it comes to that, and how you say something different and how you stand out from the crowd, is really thinking about two key areas. It's about offering access, whether that be to customers, or offering some kind of unique insight that potential customers or the industry isn't aware of, and being able to give those two things, or one of those two things, and to be able to talk about those will really help to resonate with buying audiences. So if an IoT tech vendor is able to speak to a specific challenge or an opportunity that you presented to an IoT buyer, and developing thought leadership, or demonstrating case studies, any work that they've done surrounding that, then that's a really great way to be able to cut through the noise, because as you said, that there's lots happening in the market, and from the report, buyers really just want to see can vendors walk the walk as much as they can talk the talk, and having that access to potential customers, or having some really unique insight that is really valuable to their buying audience is going to be really important.
Right, thank you. And then I think just finally, Matt, we talked about, or Chloe talked about earlier on, that how many more vendors are now using industry analysts as part of their, buyers using industry analysts much more as part in their buying journeys and decisions. And so I think you have an important role to play for them there. Do you find that you are taking a consultative approach with them and talking through their particular problems before identifying potential partners, or are you sort of sharing information and allowing them to reach their own decisions, which is a more common route for you?
It's much more of a consultative approach, actually. We put together reports that are compare and contrast, looking at capabilities of various players. I talked about the hyperscalers one. We did one on digital transformation service providers, looking at systems integrators and consultancies, and another one looking at sort of industrial type companies, the Siemens and the GEs and so on, looking at the relative capabilities, and that gets you so far, and it's useful to understand, but the reality is that every company's requirements are unique, and therefore you've really got to start not quite from scratch, because you've got an underlying understanding of who the vendors are and what capabilities they've got, but you really do have to talk to them one-on-one and customize it very much.
Yeah, okay. So it's all about, everything that we've discussed today is really about that customization, isn't it? Know who your customer is, know what they need, help the customer understand what they need, and then ultimately in partnership deliver the solutions that everybody wants.
Absolutely.
Brilliant. Well, I think we're about on the limit for the webinar, so I'm going to leave it to you, Chloe, to close. Thank you very much.
Absolutely, yeah. Just to say that if any participants have any questions about anything that we discussed today, feel free to contact myself or Duncan, or if you've got any questions for Matt on anything that he spoke through, or any specific analyst research requirements, then do get in touch. But otherwise, thank you all for joining. And if you would like a recording of the webinar, do let us know. But thank you very much and have a good evening or day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.